A colony that fills every frame with brood by early April can still produce almost no harvestable honey by midsummer. That statement contradicts nearly everything modern beekeeping culture teaches about population growth and surplus production. The assumption is straightforward: more bees should mean more honey. But the biology inside that hive tells a very different story. Have you experienced this in your own hives? A booming population, wall-to-wall brood, and yet the supers sit empty while neighboring colonies with half the numbers somehow fill boxes. If this has ever frustrated you, hit the like button, because this episode is going to explain exactly why it happens and what timing decisions can shift the outcome. The heart of this problem is one of the most overlooked dynamics in colony biology: resource allocation. A honeybee colony is not a factory that simply scales output with labor. It is a superorganism that constantly triages energy between two competing demands: internal maintenance and external surplus. And when brood rearing is running at maximum capacity, the colony makes a decisive choice. It feeds the brood, it warms the brood, it prioritizes the next generation of workers over the honey stores the beekeeper is hoping to harvest. More bees, less honey. This is where the historical record becomes instructive. Before the era of package bees, stimulative feeding, and early-season queen replacement, beekeepers across Northern Europe and the American Northeast understood something about colony rhythm that has been gradually buried under the pressure to build populations as fast as possible. They understood that the timing of brood expansion relative to the main nectar flow determined whether a colony stored surplus or consumed it. Not the total number of bees, not the volume of brood, the timing. What most beekeepers misunderstand is this: a large colony is not automatically a productive colony. A colony in heavy brood-rearing mode is, biologically speaking, in a state of investment. It is spending calories, not saving them. Every capped brood cell requires roughly 12 milligrams of honey equivalent in the form of heat energy alone. When you multiply that across 10 or 12 frames of brood, which is common in a double-deep configuration by mid-spring, the colony may be consuming between 2 and 4 pounds of honey per week just for thermoregulation, separate from the nutritional demands of larval feeding. This consumption rate accelerates as brood density increases. Nurse bees require substantial protein to produce royal jelly and brood food. Foragers returning with nectar handed off to house bees, who must process, evaporate, and store it. But if the internal demand for processed food is already high, incoming nectar gets diverted before it ever reaches a super. The colony is not failing. It is functioning exactly as its biology dictates. But the beekeeper sees a strong hive with no surplus and assumes something is wrong. The critical variable is the alignment between peak brood output and peak nectar availability. In most temperate climates, the main nectar flow does not begin in earnest until late spring or early summer, depending on the dominant floral sources: clover, black locust, tulip poplar, basswood. These major sources typically peak between late May and mid-July. But aggressive brood expansion often begins 6 to 8 weeks earlier, triggered by lengthening photoperiod and the first minor pollen sources in March and early April. This creates a window, roughly 6 to 10 weeks, during which the colony is expanding rapidly, but reliable nectar income has not yet arrived. During this window, the colony draws heavily on its winter stores. A colony that entered winter with 40 or 50 pounds of honey may burn through half of that, just sustaining brood production before the first major flow begins. If the beekeeper has also been feeding syrup to stimulate early buildup, the colony ramps brood even faster, which only deepens the caloric deficit. Strong colony, weak surplus. Here is where management decisions compound the biological problem. A common spring practice is to add brood space early, opening up the second deep or adding drawn comb to prevent swarming and encourage population growth. On its face, this seems logical. More space means less congestion, which should reduce swarm impulse. But the colony's response to additional brood space is often to fill it with brood, not honey. The queen reads open comb as an invitation to lay. Nurse bees respond by increasing brood food production. The colony doubles down on expansion precisely when there is no major nectar source to fund it. The historical approach in many traditional beekeeping regions was the opposite. Beekeepers in the British Isles, Scandinavia, and parts of New England deliberately constrained brood space in early spring, not to weaken the colony, but to prevent it from overcommitting to brood before the flow could support that investment. The goal was not a smaller colony, it was a colony that peaked at the right moment, a colony that reached maximum forager population just as the main flow opened rather than 6 weeks before it. If you value biology-based beekeeping, consider subscribing. The mechanism behind this timing strategy relates directly to worker bee lifespan and the forager-to-nurse ratio. A worker bee born in mid-spring lives roughly 5 to 6 weeks during the active season. If she emerges in early April, she spends her first 3 weeks as a house bee, nursing, cleaning, processing nectar, and transitions to foraging around late April or early May. If the main flow does not begin until late May, she may have only a few days of foraging life remaining when the nectar becomes abundant. Her contribution to surplus is minimal. She was born too early to align with the flow. As conversely, a worker that emerges in mid-May transitions to foraging in early June, which in many regions coincides precisely with the peak of the main flow. She has her full 3-week foraging lifespan available during maximum nectar availability. Her per-bee contribution to surplus is dramatically higher, not because she is a better bee, but because her life cycle was timed correctly. This is the biological principle that separates a strong colony from a productive colony. Eye strength is measured in total population. Productivity is measured in how many of those bees are foraging during the window when nectar is actually available to collect. A colony with 60,000 bees in early April may have fewer active foragers during the June flow than a colony that had 35,000 bees in early April, but timed its brood peak to align with floral availability. The practical application of this principle requires the beekeeper to understand their local nectar calendar with precision. This is not a one-size-fits-all calculation. A beekeeper in central Georgia, where tulip poplar and gallberry may flow from mid-April through May, faces a different timing equation than a beekeeper in Vermont, where the main clover flow may not stabilize until mid-June. The 6-week offset between these regions means that optimal brood management strategies differ accordingly. For beekeepers in regions where the main flow begins in early to mid-June, the target brood peak should fall around late April to early May. This means the colony's maximum brood volume should occur approximately 5 to 6 weeks before the main flow opens. To achieve this, brood space expansion should be managed carefully. Rather than opening up the second deep in mid-March, a beekeeper might delay that expansion until early to mid-April, allowing the colony to build gradually on its existing comb rather than sprinting into maximum brood production 8 or 10 weeks before the flow. The specific measurements matter. In a standard Langstroth configuration, a colony that covers 6 to 7 frames of brood in a single deep by the first week of April is on a reasonable trajectory for a mid-June flow. Adding the second deep at that point, when the colony is covering roughly 70% of available brood space, provides room for continued expansion without triggering an 8-week brood marathon that peaks too early. Temperature plays a role as well. Brood nest temperature must be maintained between 93 and 96 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 34 to 36 degrees Celsius, regardless of outside conditions. In early spring, when nighttime temperatures may still drop into the 30s or low 40s, maintaining this temperature across a large brood nest requires enormous caloric expenditure. A colony that has expanded brood across 12 or 14 frames in March is burning significantly more energy on thermoregulation than a colony that has concentrated brood on 6 or 7 frames, even though both colonies may have similar total bee populations. This is another dimension of the allocation problem. The bees are not lazy. They are not sick. They are simply spending their energy keeping a large brood nest warm during a period when incoming resources are insufficient to offset that cost. The result is a net drawdown of stores that leaves the colony in a caloric deficit by the time the flow arrives. Even once nectar begins coming in, the colony's first priority is to replenish depleted reserves rather than build surplus. The beekeeper sees foragers working the flow, sees nectar coming in, but the supers remain light because the colony is backfilling the brood nest with stores before it begins capping surplus above. When should the beekeeper not apply brood space restriction? There are important caveats. Colonies headed by first-year queens, which tend to have lower swarm impulse and build up more gradually, may not need restriction. Colonies that are already behind in population, covering only 3 or 4 frames of bees in mid-April, should not be constrained further. And in regions where the spring flow begins early and transitions quickly into a sustained summer flow, aggressive early buildup may genuinely be the optimal strategy. This approach is specifically relevant to regions with a distinct gap between early pollen availability and the main nectar flow. The common mistake is treating all colonies identically. A beekeeper managing 20 hives may have 5 that are building explosively in early spring and 15 that are building moderately. The explosive builders are the ones most at risk of peaking too early. These are often the colonies headed by second-year queens with proven laying rates, or colonies that were particularly well provisioned going into winter. They feel like the best colonies, and in terms of raw genetics and vitality, they may be. But without timing management, their strength becomes their vulnerability. Another mistake is confusing activity with productivity. A colony with thousands of foragers working dandelion and maple in April looks productive. Bees are flying, pollen is coming in, the entrance is busy, but dandelion and early maple provide primarily pollen with limited nectar, and that pollen is fueling further brood expansion rather than generating surplus. The visual impression of productivity masks the biological reality that the colony is still in investment mode, not surplus mode. Next, the seasonal transition from investment to surplus typically requires 2 conditions to align. First, the colony's brood-to-bee ratio must begin to stabilize, meaning the rate of new brood production slows relative to the rate of adult bee emergence. This happens naturally as the queen's laying rate levels off while previously laid brood continues to emerge. Second, a reliable and abundant nectar source must become available. When both conditions are met simultaneously, the colony shifts allocation. Incoming nectar exceeds internal demand. House bees begin processing and storing surplus above the brood nest. Foragers orient toward nectar collection rather than pollen. The colony enters what experienced beekeepers recognize as the flow, not just nectar availability, but the moment when the colony's biology aligns with it. The beekeeper's role in this process is not to force the colony into surplus mode. It is to avoid management decisions that delay the transition. Providing excessive brood space too early delays it. Stimulative feeding that accelerates brood beyond what the local flow calendar can support delays it. Splitting colonies during the buildup phase, while effective for swarm prevention, can also delay it by reducing the forager population just as the flow opens. The historical beekeepers who managed this well did not have access to detailed biological research. They had observation. They knew that a colony left to build at its own pace in a single chamber through early spring, then, given room just before the flow, would often outproduce a colony that had been aggressively expanded from February onward. They described it in different language, letting the bees tell you when they're ready. But the underlying principle was the same. Align colony growth with resource availability. Do not force the colony to peak before the nectar is there to harvest. The outcome of this approach is not dramatic. It does not double production or guarantee record harvests. What it does is reduce the incidence of strong colonies that produce disappointing surplus. It stabilizes yield by ensuring that the colony's peak foraging capacity coincides with peak nectar availability. It prevents the frustrating pattern of watching a powerful colony burn through its stores in April and May, only to spend June and July recovering rather than producing. Biology does not reward the biggest colony. It rewards the best-timed colony. The bees have not changed. The flowers have not changed. What has changed is the pressure to build fast, build early, and equate population with production. The colony that peaks in sync with the flow, not 6 weeks ahead of it, is the colony that fills supers. Not because it has more bees, but because its bees are doing the right work at the right time. If this breakdown was useful, leave a comment with your experience. Subscribe for more historically grounded beekeeping insights.